Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, let the quiet wind guide you toward the valley where the castle stands, with its gates closed through 100 winters. Here, within these stories, the snow never hurries, the seasons drift slowly, and each word falls like a soft echo across sleeping hills. Settle into the hush as we walk together through stone corridors and forgotten chambers, where time itself holds its breath beneath frost-laden skies. Snow drifted across the silent road in pale, swirling veils, gathering along the stones as though time itself had paused to watch the white winter settling over the hills and valleys that led to the castle gates. The air held that quiet stillness only deep winter knows, where even the wind moves softly, carrying the faint smell of pine smoke from distant hearths, and your breath rises in fragile clouds that vanish too quickly to leave any trace. Somewhere behind you, the world felt warm and full of life, with windows glowing faintly in the far-off village, and voices carrying across the frozen night. But here, before the castle gates, the world seemed wrapped in a hush that held its own weight. The gates rose tall and dark above the drifting snow, carved from wood so ancient the grain had deepened into almost black lines, streaked with frost that glittered faintly whenever the moonlight touched the surface with its patient silver glow. You could see where iron bands held the planks together, thick and riveted, each one furred with pale frost that made the metal look softer than it was, the cold rendering everything fragile-looking, though you knew these gates had stood for centuries. Beneath your boots, the snow gave way with the faintest creak, the sound swallowed quickly by the quiet air, and even that small noise felt like a trespass here, as though the silence belonged to the place, and you had stepped into it uninvited. The walls stretched high and long on either side, their stones weathered by countless winters, edges softened by time, so that even the cold did not feel harsh, but simply inevitable. A companion that had lived here longer than memory could hold. Frost feathered the edges of the battlements, fine as spun glass, catching the moonlight in delicate traces that made the castle seem less like a fortress and more like something grown from winter itself, shaped by wind and snow rather than by hands. You tilted your head back slowly, watching the narrow slits of windows far above where no light burned, no smoke trailed, no sign of warmth or life slipped through. And for a moment it felt as though the whole place had forgotten the idea of fire. The cold pressed close, but not cruelly, a steady, unshifting thing that clung to your cloak and gloves, weaving through the wool until you could feel it settling against your skin like an old story, making itself known one page at a time. The scent here was faint but sharp, the mingling of iron, snow, and the distant tang of pine wood smoke carried from somewhere too far to see, the kind of smell that made you aware of how wide the winter night stretched beyond the walls. You remembered the villagers speaking of this place in tones too soft to carry far, as though the gates might hear if the words grew bold, saying they had been closed longer than anyone had lived, that even their grandparents had never seen them open. There had been other stories too, murmured near firelight when wind rattled shutters, about the feast that happened once before the gates closed, about the messenger who went in and never came out, about music that stopped all at once long ago. But standing here now, you felt none of the sharp edges such tales carried when told in crowded rooms, for the gates themselves gave off no sense of menace or warning, only the calm of something long past explanation, long settled into silence. A crow passed overhead then, its dark wings slicing across the pale moon, but it did not land on the battlements, instead flying toward the woods beyond. And you found yourself watching it vanish into the deep dark, as though it knew something you did not. The wind shifted briefly, lifting snow along the ground in low, curling waves, brushing the hem of your cloak. The sound like dry whispers across parchment before the air settled again. Leaving the world as quiet as before, the gates unchanged and unmoved. Your gloved hand brushed against the wood once, feeling the cold locked deep into the grain, a chill that sank through leather as though the years themselves had been frozen here, waiting without urgency or reason beneath layers of frost and shadow. No mark or carving hinted at ownership. No crest or sigil showed who had built this place or claimed it, as though the castle existed without needing a name. Standing against winter after winter in patient defiance of everything beyond its walls. You stepped back slowly, boots crunching through the thin snow, seeing the whole length of the walls again, the way they curved toward the cliffs on either side, so that the gate sat like the mouth of a question, never spoken aloud. It struck you then how the road leading here ended abruptly before the gates, buried under snow, its tracks fading quickly each winter, as though even travelers had long since learned there was no need to come this way anymore. Yet something about the place kept people speaking of it, kept them glancing toward the hills on clear days when the towers could be seen faintly against the sky, kept old stories alive even when no one truly believed them anymore. The moon climbed higher as you stood watching, its light turning the snow brighter, the shadows darker, the gates themselves outlined in silver and frost until they looked less like wood and iron and more like some idea of a gate given shape by winter. You imagined the centuries folding over each other here. Snow after snow, season after season, the gates holding against wind and sun and rain, against everything time could offer, until the years themselves grew tired of waiting for them to move. Your breath fogged the air once more, curling upward like smoke from an extinguished flame, and the sight of it made you suddenly aware of the warmth of your own body against the deep cold surrounding you on every side. It was a strange comfort, knowing the world inside your chest kept its own fire burning softly, while all around lay ice and stone and gates that remembered nothing of such small human warmths anymore. Somewhere beyond the walls, an owl called low and steady, the sound drifting through the high towers before fading again, as though the castle itself had exhaled a single breath before falling back into its long, unbroken quiet. The sky darkened slowly, the moonlight the only thing holding back the black edges of night, and the snow deepened at your feet until you could no longer tell where the road ended and the land began beneath its soft, gathering weight. For a moment you thought you saw a glimmer in one of the narrow windows above, a faint flicker like firelight, but it might have been the moon shifting behind a thin cloud, for when you looked again nothing burned there at all. The cold settled deeper into your coat, your scarf stiffening faintly with frost at the edges, but the air remained still and watchful, the gates giving nothing, no sound of chain or hinge, no creak of wood or whisper of life within. You turned at last toward the road again, the village lights faint on the horizon, the air behind you heavy with the weight of all that silence, the gates holding their long vigil, as though no 100 winters could ever change their mind. And as you walked back through the snow, the wind lifting thin veils across your path, You felt the gates at your back like eyes that did not follow, like a question that did not need answering, like a door that belonged to time itself. The night closed around the castle again, then, the moon slipping behind cloud, the walls fading into the dark until even the gates vanished from view, leaving only the sound of your steps fading slowly into the cold and waiting air. The night lay deep over the hills when the first sound came, faint and almost uncertain, as though it had traveled a long way to reach you. A thin thread of noise drifting through the cold air beyond the unmoving gates. You stood where the snow still bore no tracks but your own, the silence heavy around you. The kind of stillness that makes every sound seem larger than it should be, as though the whole world leaned in to hear. It came again, clearer this time, the measured rhythm of footsteps striking stone somewhere far beyond the walls, slow and deliberate. Not hurried like a traveler late on the road, but steady as someone moving through familiar darkness with purpose. The gates remained closed, as always, their great iron bands gleaming faintly in the moonlight, the frost clinging to them as though nothing in the world could disturb. The cold weight of wood and metal locked together through so many winters. You found yourself holding still, breath rising softly before your face, your ears straining toward that distant sound. Though the night gave no shape to it, no glimpse of who might be moving beyond walls that had held for a century, the echo carried strangely, sometimes faint as though fading, sometimes near enough that you almost thought it might cross the courtyard inside and come toward the gates, though it never did, only moving at that same steady, unbroken rhythm, somewhere out of sight. Wind slid through the nearby trees, rustling the dry, frozen branches so softly they sounded like brittle paper being turned, and the faint smell of pine drifted with it, sharp and clean, mingling with the cold weight of stone and snow. You imagined narrow passages within the castle, halls lined with dust and darkness, stairways where torchlight once burned but had long since died away, each echo ringing against walls that had not felt a human step in lifetimes. The stories told in the village returned then, fragments of memory spoken by those who had never been here themselves, tales of a messenger riding through the gates long ago and never returning, a figure swallowed by walls that closed behind him forever. They spoke of music once drifting down the hills from the great hall within, of voices lifted in song before the silence fell, before the gates sealed, and winter after winter came and went, while nothing moved across the courtyard again. But tonight something walked there, something carrying its weight across the stones, the echo too measured to be wind or animal, to belong to storm or branch or shifting snow, sounding instead like boots upon a long-forgotten floor. The moon edged higher through thin clouds, spreading pale light over the walls so the frost along the battlements glimmered faintly. But no shadow passed against that glow. No figure showed itself upon the ramparts or behind the narrow windows. The footsteps continued, never breaking rhythm, moving from one side of the unseen space within to another, sometimes pausing so briefly you almost believed they had stopped altogether, before resuming with that same hollow ring through the winter air. Your hand rested against the wood of the gates, cold seeping easily through glove and skin, the frozen grain rough beneath your palm, the sound of those steps seeming to travel through the wood itself like a voice through bone. You thought of what the inside might look like now, the flagstones under drifting snow, the fountains cracked and dry, the great hall standing empty with long tables left to dust, Banners faded to colorless tatters, stirring faintly in the wind. Perhaps someone, or something, moved through those rooms even now. Not as intruder or guest, but as keeper of a silence too deep to break, as though footsteps were the only thing left to remember the shape of life within. You imagined torches once blazing along the walls, smoke curling upward to vanish among rafters, musicians tuning their instruments while servants hurried between kitchens and tables, the whole place alive with warmth before it grew so cold and still. Yet the echoes tonight carried no warmth, only that measured hollow sound striking stone after stone, a presence too far to see, too near to ignore, circling through a place the world had left untouched for 100 long winters. The air held its breath between each sound, as though the night itself paused to listen, the snow waiting, the trees leaning inward, even the stars seeming sharper in their cold watch, while the rhythm moved beneath them through the dark. Once you thought you heard a second set of steps, lighter, quicker, following after the first like a shadow, but the sound faded before you were certain, leaving only the original pace, steady as a clock striking through empty corridors. The gates showed nothing, gave nothing, revealed no shift of hinge or chain, no light behind cracks, only their stillness and the thick weight of frost, while the echoes moved beyond them like voices speaking in a language without words. You turned your head slightly, as though changing the angle might bring sight as well as sound. But the walls stretched high and smooth, their narrow windows empty, the towers pale and sharp against the sky with no figure at their edge. The footsteps slowed then, not stopping but drawing out each strike against stone, the pause between them lengthening until the rhythm almost disappeared, before they began again with the same steady measure, crossing back the way they had come before. You stepped nearer, boots sinking softly into snow, the smell of cold iron drifting from the bands across the gates, the wood dark and locked against whatever moved inside, holding centuries of frost and echo behind its unshifting surface. Perhaps no living thing walked there at all. Only memory itself, pacing corridors where time had forgotten to keep moving, repeating steps taken long ago by someone whose name and face had long since left the world outside the walls. The thought came slowly, settling like snow over the mind, that perhaps the castle held its own dreams after so many winters, the sound of what it remembered returning sometimes like this, footsteps belonging to no present traveler at all. The wind carried a faint creak from somewhere along the walls. Wood or shutter shifting under ice, though no light followed, no breath of warmth escaped. Only the sigh of old timbers settling further into the weight of frozen years. The footsteps grew softer after a time, retreating across the distance within, until only the faintest ring carried through the gates, each one fading like ripples across water until the silence folded over itself again and nothing moved at all. You waited there longer, breath a pale cloud before your face, the moonlight silver on the frost, but the sound did not return, leaving only the stillness of gates and snow and air, too cold to hold any further echo tonight. At last you turned from the walls, the village lights faint along the horizon, your steps creaking through the frozen road where the sound of footsteps behind the gates might have been nothing more than the wind playing tricks on waiting ears. Yet as you walked, you thought of corridors you had never seen, dust stirring in rooms where no one lived, the memory of a presence moving still through a castle whose gates had stayed closed for 100 long and watching winters. The road wound downward toward the village where small lights glimmered faintly in the frost-streaked windows. A handful of lanterns swaying on wooden posts to mark the paths through snow that drifted softly against doorways and along the stone-paved square. You came there as night deepened, the air smelling faintly of wood smoke and pine resin, the warmth from open hearths spilling in gentle bands of orange across doorsteps where children's boots had left small dark hollows in the day's new snow. At the edge of the square, the lantern keepers gathered as they always did when the wind turned colder, shoulders hunched inside thick coats, gloved hands cradling mugs of cider, while the glow from their swinging lamps spread trembling halos over the snow-packed ground. They were men older than the trees above the valley, their faces lined like river stones, beards holding frost near the ends where their breath had frozen through long nights spent keeping small flames alive against wind that scoured the hills clean. The keepers tended their lanterns the way others tended fields or flocks, trimming wicks with narrow knives, pouring oil from dented tins, shielding each small light as though the darkness itself would devour it the moment they turned their backs. It was said they remembered everything carried by the wind, every sound from hills or forest, every rumor that wandered down the frozen road toward the castle gates, for no one stayed outdoors longer than men who lived by flame. When you asked about the castle, they spoke slowly, voices low, as though careful not to let the dark overhear, their words carrying the rasp of cold nights and the patience of men who watched the same shadows for decades. One keeper, with hair as white as the frost along his scarf, said the gates had closed on a winter much like this, snow drifting against the road, while a feast burned high in the hall beyond the walls. He said the music had carried down the hills as lanterns were being lit, fiddles weaving through the night air, while the kitchen's roasted birds fattened all summer, and villagers watched torches moving along the battlements like falling stars. Another man, younger though his beard was thick with ice, remembered what his father told him of a messenger who came riding late with a sealed letter bound in ribbon, cloak stiff with sleet, his horse lathered white against the cold. The messenger had gone through the gates before midnight, the torches lifting as the doors opened just wide enough for horse and rider, then shutting again with iron bolts sliding home, the music still drifting above the wind until morning. No one saw the messenger again, the younger keeper said, his hands tightening around the lantern pole, while the flame inside bent under a gust of thin wind that rattled the empty windows across the square like thin bones knocking together. The eldest keeper shook his head slowly, saying there were other tales older than that. Stories of a lord who swore the gates would never open again after a winter quarrel ended with blood-staining snow along the inner courtyard. He spoke as though the memory belonged not to him but to the wind itself. 2 nights, when wolves came close to the village edge and the lanterns burned like tiny suns, holding back whatever waited in the tree-shadowed dark. The men never argued about whose story was truest, for each seemed to hold a different piece of the same long winter. Pieces worn smooth by retelling until the years themselves no longer fit neatly between beginning and ending anymore. They said no rider had passed through since then, no wagon seeking shelter, no traveler bold enough to knock upon the wood streaked with iron. For the gates held not only against wind and snow, but against memory itself. The youngest keeper, a boy hardly grown, though his lamp swung steady in his hand, whispered that sometimes on nights without moonlight he thought he saw shapes moving high along the walls, too far to hear, yet darker than cloud. The older men did not answer him, only stared into the snow falling beyond the square where the hills rose toward towers none of them had seen up close for half their lives, though their fathers had stood at the gates once. Lanterns hissed softly as the wind shifted, snowflakes catching in their flames without dimming them. The air around the keepers heavy with smoke and cider and the iron smell drifting from the tools they carried to trim and tend the wicks. You listened while the circle of light around them pushed gently against the winter dark, their voices carrying the weight of nights spent watching roads, empty except for fox or stray dog crossing between barns, with tails low against the wind. The eldest spoke again of the feast, of tables running the length of the hall, of silver platters heaped with roasted pheasant, of wines brought from valleys farther south where snow never fell, of laughter loud enough to shake banners loose. He said the villagers watched from a distance, fires burning along the outer road as they waited for torches to descend toward the gates, thinking some gift or announcement would be carried out to them before dawn ended the celebration. Instead, the gates closed after the messenger rode in, the bolts falling with a sound that echoed down the hills like the lid of a chest slammed tight, the music dying before morning until only the wind moved through the towers. The keepers shifted closer to their lanterns, then, the light glinting in their eyes while they said no snowstorm ever buried the gates completely, though drifts rose high against the walls each year, as though winter itself wished to swallow them whole. One man said he heard footsteps there once while trimming wicks along the north road, boots striking stone inside the walls, though no door had opened in his lifetime, the sound too steady to be wind, too hollow to be animal. Another claimed he saw smoke rising from the farthest tower on a night when clouds kept the moon hidden, but when he pointed it out, the others saw only darkness, the walls sharp as broken teeth against the starless sky. The boy asked whether anyone would ever go up the road again, whether someone might knock until the gates answered. But the men only stared toward the hills where snow swallowed everything beyond the last swinging lantern on the path. They said the world had grown used to the silence now, used to waiting through winters that never changed anything, used to seeing the castle walls like cliffs holding back nothing but wind and time wearing at stone too slowly to notice. When the hour grew late, the keepers trimmed their wicks once more, the flames rising brighter, as if to mark the end of their stories. The circle of light pushing back night only far enough to reach the edge of the square. You left them there with frost clinging to their beards, lanterns burning against snow that kept falling soundlessly, their voices fading behind you, like echoes from hills where wind carried pieces of old tales, through branches older than any living memory. And as you walked toward the inn where windows glowed with heat and bread smell drifted through the doorframe, you thought of the gates still locked against the dark, of footsteps crossing empty courtyards, of music ending before anyone knew it was over. The keeper's words followed you like the faint ring of iron on stone, stories heavy with winters that waited for nothing except perhaps the next voice to carry them into another year, another telling, another night strung between flame and snow. The road toward the castle lay white beneath the moon, a pale ribbon curling through hills where frost clung to branches like thin crystal fingers, and the only sound came from the wind weaving low between the sleeping pines. They said he came at dusk, on a horse dark with sweat, cloak stiffening in the cold, the leather straps creaking beneath him as though the journey had been long and hurried, yet carrying some purpose that kept him pressing forward. You picture him bent slightly under the weight of wind and snow, the air sharp against his face, the reins gripped in gloved hands, while the forest leaned inward. The letter he carried stayed bound in red ribbon, sealed with wax that bore the crest of some distant hall, the parchment hidden against his chest where no weather could touch it, where no eye might guess what words waited within. Villagers saw him from the square as they lit lanterns along the road, flames swaying inside their glass walls, while the rider passed without slowing, horse tossing its head so that breath rose white into air already thickening with night. They watched him vanish beyond the last house, his figure folding into snow like a sentence cut short, the hoofbeats carrying over hills long after sight had gone, the sound hollow in a way that made the keepers glance at one another. The wind carried no news back, only the smell of iron from his stirrups, the brief impression of speed against frozen ground, and the thought that he had come a long way to find the gates that never welcomed anyone anymore. You imagine the climb growing steeper, hooves striking stone where the road began to wind between cliffs, slowly against the dark, like the blackened ends of winter trees. By the time he reached the gates, the last light had bled from the sky, the wood rising before him, pale with frost where moonlight touched it. Yet the torches along the walls burned that night, the keepers had said, flames bending above the battlements, while snow drifted through the light in long, slow spirals, each torch throwing a circle of warmth that ended just beyond the stone. The messenger dismounted slowly, boots sinking into the snow with a sound too soft to carry, his horse breathing hard into the dark, steam curling upward from its flanks, while the rider crossed the final distance to strike his glove against the gates. They said the knock rang hollow through the hills, the wood giving back a sound older than speech, a deep, patient echo that made dogs stir in the village far below, their voices lifting faintly before settling again under the wind. No one knew how long he waited there, only that the torches shifted above the walls, figures moving briefly through the firelight before the bolts began sliding backward one by one, the metal groaning against wood older than any living memory. The gates opened just wide enough for him to lead his horse inside, the darkness swallowing both man and beast, while the hinges gave a low creak that carried across the frozen road like the closing of some great wooden chest. Music floated outward then, faint but clear, the kind played for dancing rather than marching, a lilting tune threading between bursts of laughter and the clatter of cups. Striking tables somewhere deep inside the castle where windows burned with firelight. They said the rider turned once before the doors shut, glancing back toward the hills as though measuring the distance between himself and the world beyond, before the gates closed again with iron sliding home until nothing remained but wind. The villagers waited through that night for him to return, the square bright with lanterns, men stamping cold from their boots while women carried out bread wrapped in cloths, voices rising softly whenever hoofbeats drifted near before fading into silence again. Morning found the gates still closed, snow heaped against their base where wind had driven it into long curves. the torches cold above the walls. And no rider came down the road, though the villagers stayed until their own fires burned low. You think of him now, the cloak stiff with frost, the letter sealed in red ribbon, the way his horse shook its mane before vanishing behind doors that no one in the village had seen open again after that night. Perhaps he delivered his message and stayed for the feast. Perhaps some warm hall welcomed him with music and bread and the glow of firelight. After miles of frozen road had worn both man and beast thin as shadows on snow. Or perhaps the gates kept not only strangers out, but also whatever crossed within. Some silent agreement written long before the messenger came riding, with his breath fogging the air like a signal disappearing before anyone could read its meaning. The keepers told the story as though unsure whether to envy or fear him, for he had seen what lay beyond the walls, even if only for one night, even if only for the space between gates closing and music ending. They said sometimes in storms you could hear a single hoof striking stone inside the courtyard, a slow, uneven sound like a horse pawing the ground while waiting for its rider, though no lantern ever showed more than empty snow through the gates. You wonder if the letter still lies somewhere beyond those walls, its seal unbroken. The ribbon faded from red to brown, while dust gathers across words no one read. The silence heavier for carrying speech that never found its listener. The road holds no sign of him now, only snow smoothed by wind each winter until no hoofprint could remain. No trace of iron shoe or leather strap or the hollow ring of hooves carrying a message across frozen hills. Sometimes travelers asked about him in the village, men waiting near the square when storms kept them from moving on. But the keepers only lifted their lanterns against the wind and said, the story belonged to the gates now, not to them. You picture the rider pausing somewhere beyond the walls, hand resting against a doorframe, while music drifted from the hall behind him. The warmth of fire touching his face, though outside the wind kept rising through the hills like a tide. Perhaps he stayed for only one song before the gates closed forever, before the snow buried the road leading back, before the torches went dark above walls that held their silence like breath gathering for a word no one would speak. And maybe the castle remembers him the way stone remembers cold, the way wood remembers fire, the way wind remembers every path it has ever crossed, carrying faint hoofbeats through corridors where nothing else has moved for 100 long winters. They said the music never truly stopped that night, only softened until it threaded faintly through corridors heavy with warmth, the melodies lingering like the smell of bread rising beside the fire long after its crust had turned golden. You picture long tables beneath the vaulted ceiling, the air steeped in the scent of roasted meats and spiced wine, wax dripping slowly from candles whose flames swayed whenever someone passed too near, with sleeves brushing the heavy winter air. The walls bore banners dulled by years of smoke, the colors faded to deep autumn shades, and torches burned in iron brackets so old their shapes seemed carved rather than forged, their edges blackened where flame had licked them countless times. Snow clung faintly to boots left by the door, the floor slowly darkening as warmth melted the white into small glistening pools where servants moved quickly with cloths, leaving behind faint echoes of footsteps before firelight dried the stones again. You imagine the messenger seated near the hearth, steam lifting from his cloak while the musicians played softly from a corner, each note weaving upward to settle beneath rafters, blackened by centuries of smoke rising from countless feasts before this one. Platters carried dishes he might never have tasted before, breads braided with herbs, bowls of stew rich enough to steam the air, silver cups filled with wine dark as evening itself, each one leaving warmth in his hands before his throat. Voices rose around him, not in haste, but in the slow, curling way of comfort after long travel. A tide of words carrying laughter between bursts of song, the air thick with heat until even the windows turned soft with fog. The hall smelled of pine boughs set above the mantel, the resin sharp beneath the sweetness of wine, beneath the slow roasting of chestnuts that popped faintly where they rolled near the fire, their shells darkening until servants gathered them in cloths. You picture him watching the dancers, women with skirts brushing the floor, men with boots, polished though dust from the road still clung faintly at the edges, all moving in patient circles while music carried their shadows across the walls. Somewhere beyond the hall lay rooms no visitor saw, staircases curving upward toward windows rimed with frost, doors that opened only for the household itself. Yet tonight their darkness stayed folded around the hall like a cloak drawn tight against snow. The feast seemed endless in the way winter nights stretch until hours blur, until the line between late and early disappears, until candles burn low and are replaced without pause, while the music turns soft enough to resemble memory itself. They said the messenger barely spoke, answering when spoken to, yet keeping his eyes on the fire, as though the flames held something only he could read. Perhaps the words of the letter sealed against his chest. Until that night, servants moved quietly among the tables with fresh loaves, their hands wrapped in cloth against the heat, the smell following them through the hall like a shadow, each loaf darkening the air with warmth before knives split it into halves. Wine breathed its sweetness through silver cups, its surface glowing in the firelight, while dancers passed, skirts brushing benches where children slept against their mothers' sides, the music soft enough to keep dreams unbroken, though feet still turned slowly across stone. The castle itself seemed to breathe with them, beams creaking softly above the hall, shutters rattling faintly where wind leaned against the walls, as though the whole place carried the sound of winter pressing close, yet never crossing the threshold. You imagine the messenger tasting the stew, the heat rising through the spoon into his hands, the broth thick with herbs crushed into darkness, potatoes splitting softly against his teeth, while the hall swayed with music growing slower near midnight. Frost had gathered along the high windows, delicate as breath upon glass, the patterns curling outward like handwriting across the panes. Letters from the cold, spelling words no one inside could read, while firelight pushed faint circles against the ice. Some said he carried his letter always at his side, even during the feast, the ribbon still bright beneath the folds of his cloak, as though he meant to deliver it before dawn, though music kept postponing the moment again and again. Perhaps the letter bore news of war or peace, or simply greetings from another hall across the mountains. Yet the fire burned too warmly, the bread tasted too sweet, the dancers moved too slowly for words to cross the room. The messenger must have felt the warmth sink deep into his limbs, the long road falling away with each passing song, the hooves, the hills, the frozen air reduced now to a faint memory carried on his cloak, stiffening by the hearth. You see him sitting long after the last course, his cup empty beside him, the musicians playing a song so soft it seemed to come from another room, though no doors opened, no footsteps crossed the hall, carrying the sound. The feast ended the way snow falls, not abruptly, but with a slow fading. The dancers drifting toward benches, the musicians pausing between songs, until silence carried the hall like a tide pulling outward, leaving only faint echoes clinging behind. Candles burned low, their wax gathered thick at the bases, flames bowing faintly in the wind that found its way through unseen cracks, though the shutters stayed tight, though the torches still burned beyond the courtyard walls above the empty road. The messenger rose at last, as though preparing to leave. His cloak lifted from the hearth, where it had dried stiff with heat, the letter still sealed, the hall still warm, though outside the moon climbed pale above the sleeping hills. They said. He paused near the door, the music gone now, the guests sleeping near fires that had burned since dusk. Only the servants moving softly through the hall with cloths gathering cups, sweeping crumbs from tables worn smooth with use. He never returned to the village below, though riders waited many nights for him, though travelers asked about the letter, though the road bore no new prints leading outward, only the wind smoothing snow against the closed gates once again. Perhaps he stayed because the hall kept him warm when the world beyond froze, because music held him when silence waited outside, because bread and wine had made him forget the letter and the road and the waiting villages below. Or perhaps the feast still waits somewhere beyond the 100 winters, the tables set, the music softened, the dancers pausing mid-step, the bread still warm in loaves no one has broken, as though time itself stopped when the gates closed again. You think of that night when the flames burned low but steady, when frost curled along the windows, though warmth never left the hall, when music and silence stood together just long enough to make the air hold its breath forever. And maybe the feast lies frozen even now, the tables laden, the candles glowing without burning lower, the messenger waiting to deliver his letter, the dancers circling endlessly while snow falls outside where no one opens the gates anymore. Long before the gates locked for the first time, the towers had already learned the language of the wind, for they stood highest against the sky, their stones drinking the winter sun, while shadows slipped along their slanted roofs like silent birds. You imagine climbing those spiral steps, each one worn in the center where countless boots once passed, the air tightening as you rise, growing cooler, the smell of iron and old wood drifting through arrow-slit windows where daylight breaks into narrow ribbons. The walls grow thinner near the top until the sound of the wind threads itself through the stairwell, carrying scents from the world below, pine smoke from distant cottages, snow brushed off branches by passing deer, the cold taste of untouched air. Up here the towers keep no company except clouds, yet the rooms beneath their roofs once held watchmen with cloaks wrapped tight, men who warmed their hands against lantern glass, who poured coffee into tin cups while the wind beat softly outside. Sometimes you think they must have spoken little, for wind teaches silence quickly, stealing words before they leave your mouth, bending trees below into slow gestures, smoothing snow until even hoofprints vanish like thoughts never spoken aloud again. You see them pausing by the window slits, faces turned toward the hills where pale rivers froze mid-curve, where the road wound away until distance erased it, until the next valley kept its secrets beneath a curtain of gray sky. The towers faced the wind as though listening, their narrow windows like eyes squinting against sunlight sliding through torn clouds, the air so cold it seemed carved, lifting loose snow into veils that drifted along the cliffs below the castle walls. Sometimes a bell hung there in the higher rooms, its bronze rim darkened by years, though no one rang it after the gates closed. Its tongue frozen in the way memories freeze when no voice calls them back into the present. You imagine running your hand along the tower's inner stones, the mortar smooth from age, faint warmth clinging where sun reached through windows just long enough to press its pale hand before withdrawing again, leaving the air cool with evening. Above, the roof creaked softly, wind leaning against it as though testing each beam, the sound traveling downward through the spiral-like breath along a flute, stirring faint dust where no boots have passed since the 100th winter began outside. The watchman once left breadcrumbs near the window ledges where crows perched, their feathers dark against snowlight, eyes glinting as though carrying messages from forests no one crossed after nightfall, the crumbs vanishing before frost gathered along the stone again. You picture them drinking slowly from tin cups, steam rising in thin ribbons, the bitter smell of coffee spreading into corners where blankets hung heavy with damp from snow shaken off cloaks, the warmth small but steady against the cold air. Lanterns burned low against the walls, their glass trembling faintly whenever the wind pressed harder, shadows moving like slow water along beams where names were carved by men long gone, dates barely legible beneath the soot of countless winters. Sometimes the towers groaned in wind stronger than usual, the beams settling against stone with the patience of trees bending rather than breaking, snow sliding from the roof to vanish below, its sound muffled before reaching the drifts gathering at the base. You imagine them lowering the heavy shutters when storms came, the iron hinges shrieking softly before closing against snow so thick it erased even the line between earth and sky, leaving only wind's hollow voice circling the towers through the night. The watchman slept near the hearth when firewood lasted, its smoke twisting slowly upward before vanishing through a vent cut long ago by masons who never saw this century, the heat barely enough to push back the cold along the floor. Sometimes they boiled thin soup in iron pots, its steam smelling faintly of onions and salt, the bowls warming their hands, though not always their hunger. The night long enough to stretch silence, until even the fire snapped less often than before. The wind never stopped speaking to the towers, tracing their edges, whistling faintly across slits where arrows once waited. Though no battle ever came, the air shaping itself around stone like water, slowly polishing a shape no one else sees. Some nights the moon hung near the towers, its light pressing silver along the roof tiles until frost glittered faintly, the windows catching pale reflections that slid across the walls like thoughts too distant to name before they disappeared again. You think of how the watchman must have counted stars when the wind grew softer, leaning against the cold stone sill, tracing constellations their fathers taught them, names carried through generations while the towers listened yet spoke nothing in return. The smell of oil from their lanterns stayed even after the flames died, clinging to gloves left drying near the hearth, 2 blankets folded against the wall, to the wooden ladder leading upward where bells slept through another long winter night. They wrote nothing down, at least nothing found, though some say a single book lay near the hearth once, its pages brittle with heat, ink fading where hands too cold pressed too hard, the words barely holding against the turning years. You imagine the wind lifting its corners before the shutters closed, carrying one page toward the floor, where boots left a faint print beside it, the letters blurring when melted snow spread slowly across the ink, before firelight dried the edges. The towers watched centuries change below them, saw roofs rise in the village and then vanish under storms, saw orchards planted and later abandoned, saw riders pass in banners once bright before fading into dust on roads no longer kept. Even after the gates locked, after fires went out in the lower courtyards, the towers kept listening, as though waiting for one sound in particular, a horn, a shout. You wonder if the wind ever grew tired of speaking when no one answered, if its voice carried loneliness across valleys where rivers froze, where wolves moved beneath pines, where no smoke rose from cottages shuttered against another endless winter night. The towers held their shape, though storms leaned hard, though frost split smaller stones, though moss softened the edges near the base where snowmelt gathered each spring before freezing again, the cold folding itself layer by layer around the foundations. Perhaps one day the wind will find a doorway left ajar, carrying seeds into cracks where roots will pry apart what hammers once joined. Though for now the towers still rise against sky as pale as old linen washed too often. You imagine them at dawn, when fog climbs from the river, their shapes barely visible until sunlight slides slowly down their roofs, until the valley brightens beneath clouds, drifting away as though night left reluctantly yet never fully surrendered its hold. The watchmen are gone, their cups cold, their blankets folded, yet the towers keep their windows open to wind threading endlessly through empty rooms, carrying the smell of snow, the faint taste of distance, the soft weight of voices never answered. And maybe that is why the bells stay silent, even now, their ropes stiff with age, their tongues unmoved, waiting for hands that will not return, for signals no one sends any more across a valley where winter keeps its long memory. You leave the towers standing there in your thoughts, listening as they always have, the wind moving through them like breath through an instrument, low and patient, shaping a song no one hears except the hills and the endless snow. The evening always came quietly here, like a curtain being drawn across the sky with the lightest of hands, and you would find yourself wandering toward the slope behind the castle, where the last rays pooled against the stone walls before vanishing altogether, as though they too wished to linger for one more breath of warmth before surrendering to the cold night. You remember how the air always grew softer in those moments, not warmer, for nothing was warm in that country of long winters, but softer in the way it touched your face and the edges of your cloak, as though the wind itself wished to walk more gently across the earth before darkness claimed the hills. The slope had no path, and yet you knew each stone and hollow by heart, each stubborn tuft of frozen grass crackling beneath your boots, and as you climbed, the sound of the world seemed to grow quieter, until only the faint murmur of distant water and the slow sigh of branches bending beneath snow reached your ears. Above you the sky deepened into colors you could never name, hues between blue and violet, streaked with silver, as though someone had brushed a single finger across frost and let it melt in thin, shimmering lines across the horizon, fading with every breath of wind. The castle gates, far below now, always looked different from here, their iron shapes softened by distance, appearing not like barriers, but like part of the land itself, as if they had grown from the earth, just as the cliffs and pines had, ancient and unmoving, and somehow necessary. You would sit on the flat stone near the top, the one the sun warmed longer than any other before its leaving, and draw your cloak tighter, not against the cold alone, but against the feeling that the evening always carried, that sense of being watched by time itself, unhurried and infinite. The first stars often came before the last color left the sky, pale at first, like faint chalk marks on dark cloth, and then one by one they would sharpen, their edges glimmering as though they had been waiting for the night to arrive before showing their true selves again. There was a smell here you loved, though you never told anyone, a mixture of pine sap and snow, and the faint smoke drifting from the unseen cottages beyond the hills. And it always filled you with a quiet you could never quite name, like a memory of something you had lost but could not recall. Sometimes you would close your eyes just to hear the wind better, to feel it moving across the grass and stone around you, to let it press against your cloak in long, unbroken breaths that carried with them the scent of the forest and the sharpness of the river ice. It was here, on this slope, that you often thought of the lives within the castle walls, of the people who moved through its narrow corridors and climbed its towers to light lanterns that glowed faintly behind high, arched windows like watchful eyes against the coming dark. The gates were always locked, yes, but life still moved behind them, slow and persistent. The way moss grows along old stone, or the way roots twist deeper beneath frozen soil, even when nothing blooms above. And this thought always brought you a strange, unexplainable comfort. You imagined the kitchens, where fires burned low and steady, where someone stirred a pot that sent up faint curls of steam, scented with herbs you could almost taste, the warmth spilling through doorways, even if you stood too far away to feel it. The sound of a bell sometimes drifted across the distance, not the bell that once called the gates open, but the smaller one near the inner courtyard, its tone softer, more domestic, telling of meals or prayers or meetings whose purposes you never learned. You would watch the faint lights blink alive, one by one, in narrow windows as night settled deeper, until the castle no longer looked like stone at all, but like a cluster of small fires, huddled together against the wind sweeping across the empty hills. There was no loneliness in this watching, only a stillness that filled you slowly, like snow gathering on a roof, soft and without hurry, until the weight of it became part of the place itself, inseparable from stone and earth and sky. You often thought of the 100 winters spoken of in the village, of how people counted them like beads on a string, marking each passing season with stories about why the gates stayed shut, though no two stories ever seemed to agree. Some said the gates were locked because of a promise made long ago, a vow carved into the stone itself that none alive had seen but all believed in, though its words had long since scattered like leaves in wind. Others claimed the gates would open only when someone returned, someone whose name had been lost, yet whose shadow lingered in paintings, fading behind the high windows where no one but the wind could look now. But most often, when the nights grew deep and the snow fell thick, people said the gates stayed closed because the castle preferred silence, that it had grown used to its own heartbeat echoing through halls empty of visitors, content with its solitude. You never chose between the stories because none felt right, and yet all of them felt possible, like dreams that dissolve upon waking but leave behind the faint outline of something you are sure was once real. The wind often grew colder after the last light left the hills, curling through the pines with long, mournful voices that seemed to carry words you almost understood if only you stayed a little longer in the dark. You always stayed until the first frost began forming along the edge of your cloak, until your breath rose like smoke before you, until the stars sharpened so fiercely above the towers that they looked like nails pinning the sky in place. Then, and only then, would you rise and turn back toward the village path, the lights below trembling faintly as though seen through water. The gates silent behind you, yet somehow aware, as if they too were watching the sky deepen with another winter's night. And as you walked down the slope, with snow beginning to whisper beneath your steps, you felt the night closing around the hills and the river and the forest beyond, wrapping everything in its long, dark arms, as though it meant to keep the world still until morning. The castle never moved, never spoke, never gave any sign that the gates would one day open. And yet each evening felt like part of a slow conversation you could not hear, only sense, like voices murmuring through stone from some other time. You reached the bottom of the slope where the path bent toward the village, and behind you the gates waited in their silence, the lights burning faintly above them like tired eyes, keeping watch over a world falling once again into snow and shadow. There were mornings when the frost lay so thick across the valley that the world seemed carved from glass, each tree branch holding its own thin miracle of crystal, each blade of grass standing stiff and pale as though time itself had paused overnight. You would wake to the hush that always followed a heavy frost, a stillness broken only by the faint creak of wood from the cottages beyond the hill and the muted scrape of someone clearing snow from a path that would soon vanish again beneath the wind. The air had a taste on those mornings, sharp and clean, carrying the faintest hint of smoke from fires still clinging to their embers, and you would breathe it in slowly, as though it might keep you warm from the inside out. Your breath always rose in pale ribbons before your face, each one curling briefly into the light before dissolving into nothing, as though the cold sky accepted each offering only to swallow it whole without a sound. The castle stood the same as ever through the frost, its walls pale with ice, its gates rimmed with silver light, the metal glowing faintly where the sun reached it and fading back to shadow where the towers leaned over in still, patient silence. From the village you would watch the smoke from your own chimney rise toward the unmoving banners along the battlements, the cloth stiff with winter's touch, and wonder if anyone behind those walls leaned out to see the same sky you did. Sometimes the sun burned through the mist slowly, a dim circle brightening above the pines until the world glowed faintly gold, the frost shining as though thousands of small lanterns had been set upon the fields for no one but the wind to see. You always loved that hour before the frost began to melt, before footsteps or cartwheels cut dark lines through the whiteness, before the day's work scattered the quiet into voices and movement, and the ordinary rhythm of living returned again. The gates never stirred, even when the frost weighed heavy upon them, their iron shapes crusted with ice that cracked softly as the wind moved through the valley. Small sounds, like whispers, meant only for those who stood close enough to hear. There was beauty in their stillness, in the way they bore each winter without complaint, their hinges gathering snow, the way the old trees gathered birds, holding fast as though the weight of cold seasons belonged to them alone. You wondered sometimes what the gates remembered. If iron could keep memories the way stone held echoes. If each winter layered itself upon the last, until the silence you felt there was the sound of 100 years breathing beneath the metal. The villagers rarely spoke of the gates during daylight, their stories belonging more to nights when the wind curled around chimneys and the firelight shook along the walls, when even simple things carried the weight of mystery, because the dark asked for it. But you thought of them often under the pale sun, watching the light creep along the walls, the shadows of the towers stretching slowly across the snow, as though time itself moved differently inside those closed gates. Sometimes you imagined someone sweeping the frost from the inner courtyards, unseen and silent, the sound of their broom soft as falling snow, the slow rhythm of work done only for its own sake, because no visitor would ever cross the threshold to see it. You could almost hear the clink of a bucket set beside a well, the faint thud of wood against wood where firewood was stacked carefully beneath the eaves, the low murmur of voices carrying through stone corridors like wind winding through hollow places. None of it felt lonely, only far away, as though life inside the gates belonged to another season altogether, one you might glimpse only in pieces, never in its fullness, the way a dream slips from you when morning comes too quickly. The cold never left the valley even when the sun rose higher, only softened slightly, as though it too carried respect for the long winters here, unwilling to chase them away entirely, lest the hills forget the sound of snow against their slopes. By midday the frost thinned into water along the rooftops, dripping slowly into the waiting barrels below, each drop bright as glass in the light, before breaking into ripples that vanished before they could freeze again. You would stand sometimes near the stream where the edges held ice, but the center still moved dark and quick beneath the surface, carrying with it pieces of reflected sky that broke apart whenever a gust of wind rippled across the water. The castle walls shone faintly in those reflections, bent and twisted by the current, until the towers looked as though they swayed like trees despite their stillness above, the image vanishing completely whenever a bird skimmed low across the water's skin. You always watched for birds in winter, their wings cutting slow arcs against the pale sky, their calls thin and high and fleeting, sounds that disappeared almost as soon as they arrived, as though even the air could not keep hold of them for long. They perched sometimes along the walls, small dark shapes against the snow-bright stone, shifting their feet as though the cold beneath them belonged to someone else, and they were only borrowing it until the wind called them onward again. The gates never moved when the birds gathered there, though you liked to imagine the iron felt each small weight the way your own hands felt snow falling against them, a brief cold presence that vanished before warmth could reach it. You thought often about warmth in those days, how it existed only in fragments across the winter world, steam lifting from a kettle, the glow beneath a cottage door, the faint flush on someone's face after walking through the wind too long. Perhaps you sometimes thought the castle kept its warmth for itself, folding it carefully into its deep rooms where fires burned behind stone walls, saving it like a secret against the long patience of the season outside. You never tried to go closer on those days of heavy frost, content to watch from the hill or the edge of the stream, knowing the gates would not answer, and yet feeling as though your watching was part of the ritual the winters asked for. There was a rhythm to it you could never explain, a slow exchange between the silence of the castle and the silence of the hills, as though both waited for something neither could name, yet neither wished to end too soon. When evening finally returned, carrying with it the same long shadows and pale winds, you would walk back through the village with the gates behind you, their frost-dark edges fading into the dusk like something slowly being erased from the day. And as the first lamps began to glow along the cottages and the smoke thickened above the rooftops, you felt again that soft, familiar weight inside you, the kind that belonged not to fear or sadness, but to the quiet knowledge that some doors were meant to stay closed until the world itself was ready to open them. There were evenings when the sky lowered slowly toward the hills, the light turning soft as wool, and the air settled into the kind of quiet that felt older than the valley itself, as though the world were pausing to remember something forgotten. You would stand at the edge of the village as the wind drifted through the bare trees, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke and the sharper scent of snow waiting somewhere beyond the horizon, a breath away but not yet falling. The cottages gathered their lamplight slowly, each window brightening like a small promise against the long dark, and the glow moved across the walls and the frost-silvered roofs in a way that always made you think of candles lit inside a cathedral at night. The gates of the castle never changed when the darkness came, yet you felt them watching in some quiet way, their iron edges cutting sharp lines against the deepening blue of the sky, the towers fading into silhouettes that leaned gently toward the stars. It was not a watching you could see, only sense, the way one senses the nearness of water in a forest by the taste of air alone, the way you feel warmth inside a room before the fire reveals itself to your eyes. You sometimes walked the narrow path toward the hill as evening fell, your boots pressing soft shapes into the pale frost, each step releasing a faint crunch that scattered into the wind before reaching the walls waiting in the distance. The wind changed as you climbed higher, carrying the low whistle of branches bending against it, and the faint call of birds flying late toward the shelter of the trees where night always arrived more quickly. The cold deepened the higher you walked, settling along your shoulders like a heavy shawl, creeping through your sleeves until your arms felt stiff and numb. And yet you always found yourself stopping to watch the gates long before the path ended. From there you could see the lanterns flickering near the village below, small gold circles blooming and fading against the frost-dark earth, their light so soft it looked like it might be swept away by the next breath of wind. The castle kept no lights along its walls, no torches along the battlements or windows spilling fireglow against the snow. Only the moon finding its edges and laying silver along the highest stones like someone tracing the lines of a sleeping face. Sometimes clouds drifted slowly across that same moon, turning the light thin and blue so the walls looked carved from ice, the shadows pooling deeper beneath the towers until the gates themselves seemed to vanish and reappear between each passing cloud. You always wondered how many nights had looked exactly like this across the 100 winters behind those walls. How many moons had set silver crowns on the same towers, while snow pressed quietly against the same silent gates. There was comfort in the thought that seasons might repeat themselves without hurry, that winter might come again and again like the turning of a great, slow wheel, carrying the same frost, the same winds, the same soft stars into place each year. You felt your own life moving differently beside that thought, faster somehow, like water running beside a frozen field, carrying pieces of time forward, even as the valley seemed to keep its breath held beneath the weight of snow and stone. The gates never belonged to haste, never belonged to the kind of days that passed quickly beneath the sun, or the kind of nights that carried voices across the hills. They belonged to the long patience of things that last longer than memory itself. You would stay until the frost began to creep through your boots, and your breath rose too thickly before your face to ignore, until the cold wind reminded you that even those who keep watch must one day return to the warmth waiting below. The path downward always felt softer than the one leading up, as though the earth itself guided you back toward firelight and the slow comfort of rooms where the windows kept the wind out and the kettle sang softly over the hearth. Sometimes you paused when the first cottage door came into view, standing still for a moment to listen to the faint sounds of spoons against bowls, the gentle murmur of voices carrying through the wood and stone like warmth made into sound. It was always the warmth you noticed first when you finally stepped inside, the air heavy with the smell of stew and smoke and pine logs burning slow and steady, the door closing behind you like the turning of a page in a quiet book. The cold left you slowly, as though it, too, wanted to linger a little longer, your fingers stinging faintly as they found the edge of the bowl set before you, the steam rising in small ribbons that smelled of salt and root vegetables and slow-simmered meat. The firelight wrapped itself along the walls, catching the wooden beams above and the rows of jars on the shelves, each glass surface glinting like something half awake, reflecting the small dance of flames inside the hearth. You always ate slowly on nights like that, listening to the wind leaning against the shutters and the faint drip of melted frost falling from the eaves outside, each sound carrying the weight of winter without ever breaking the peace it brought. Sometimes someone would mention the castle in a low voice, as though speaking of it too clearly might wake something in the walls beyond the hill, and the talk would drift for a while before fading back into the soft crackle of firewood. You never added much to those conversations, never told them how you had stood in the cold watching the gates as though waiting for something you could not name, as though the silence itself had called you to bear witness to it. The warmth would finally reach your toes, your shoulders, the last chill along your face, until you felt yourself sinking slowly into the same rhythm as the room, the same unhurried quiet that seemed to follow every winter night here. Outside, the gates would still be standing beneath the moonlight, the towers keeping their long, patient watch above the valley, the snow gathering against the walls, the way thoughts gather slowly before sleep takes them away. And as the fire burned lower and the lamplight dimmed, you always felt the strange comfort of knowing the gates would not open tonight, that some silences were meant to last until the world itself decided to give them back their voices. There were mornings when the frost arrived before the light, leaving the valley wrapped in pale silver that caught against every roof tile, branch, and fence post, until the whole world seemed carved from some brittle, shining crystal left too long in the cold. You would wake to the sound of the wind threading itself through the narrow spaces between walls, carrying the faint smell of pine smoke from chimneys you could not yet see, only sense somewhere beyond the drifting veil of whitened air. The village moved slowly on mornings like these, the doors opening one by one, as though the houses themselves were yawning against the chill, their thresholds spilling little curls of warm breath that vanished quickly into the waiting cold outside. You always felt the morning air first along your hands when you pulled on your coat, the sleeves stiff with frost where they had hung overnight, the fabric giving off the faint smell of wood and wool and something faintly metallic from the cold itself. The path to the well crunched beneath your boots, the frost brittle enough to crack like sugar glazing beneath each step. The handle of the bucket cold enough to sting your fingers even through the thick wool of your gloves. When you bent to draw water, the rope gave off a soft wooden groan, the bucket dipping into the dark shape of the well where the air rose cold and damp and carrying the smell of stone and stillness from far below. The frozen ground. You would pause sometimes just to hear the distant echo of water moving faintly against the sides, a sound too quiet to measure, as though the earth itself were keeping its voice low in the long hush of winter mornings. The castle gates could be seen even from here, their high edges catching the pale light of the slowly waking sun, the towers wearing faint crowns of snow that did not yet melt, because the day was too cold for such hurry. You often watched the light climb the walls slowly, each stone seeming to gather warmth it never shared, the gates themselves remaining in shadow longer than anything else, as though they wished to keep their silence wrapped close for as long as they could. The smoke from your own chimney lifted into the wind when you finally carried the water home, the rising column bending and unraveling until it thinned into the pale sky, leaving behind only the faint smell of pine resin burning somewhere out of sight. Inside, the air carried the heavier warmth of bread baking, the walls themselves seeming to hold the heat close as though they had swallowed it from the oven and were reluctant to let it escape too soon into the morning cold. You always felt your fingers thaw slowly beside the kettle as steam rose against the window glass, leaving soft patterns that blurred the view of the frost-bright world outside, turning it into a painting of pale shapes and glimmering edges. By the time you stepped outside again, carrying the small bundle of bread wrapped in cloth to cool upon the table, the light had reached the edge of the hill where the path began its long climb toward the waiting gates above. Some mornings you walked there simply to see the valley from above, the roofs dusted with white, the smoke lines lifting like threads toward the clouds, the river frozen in places where it curved beneath the bridge carrying carts into town. The cold deepened as you climbed, the air growing thinner and clearer until each breath felt carved into your lungs like something too sharp to belong to living air, leaving your cheeks stung red against the wind. Sometimes a crow passed overhead, its shadow sliding across the snow, its wings lifting slow and deliberate against the pale sun, as though even flight itself had grown heavy in the deep heart of winter. The gates always met you in silence, the iron dark against the bright snow, the wood bound with frost so thick it looked painted there by the long hand of night itself, unwilling to leave even beneath the day's slow warmth. You never tried to push them, never thought to knock upon the wood or call toward the towers, because some part of you believed the walls already knew you were there, the way hills know the wind or rivers know the rain. Instead, you stood there with the snow shifting faintly around your boots, the wind curling against the edges of your coat, the breath leaving your mouth in soft clouds that drifted toward the gates before vanishing against the frozen air. You always noticed the small things on mornings like this, the way frost gathered along the corners of stone steps, the way the iron bolts on the gates shone faintly where the sun struck them through thin lines of melting ice. Sometimes the quiet carried a faint sound from inside the walls, something too soft to name, like the echo of a footstep or the creak of wood against wind, though you could never be sure if it belonged to memory or the present. You would stand there for a long time, your eyes tracing the curves of snow gathered along the battlements, the lines of icicles leaning from the roof edges like glass teeth, too beautiful to belong to anything harsh or hungry. The cold always reached you fully before you left, creeping through the seams of your boots until your toes ached, sliding beneath your coat despite the wool layers, until the thought of the fire back home began to outweigh the pull of the gates. The walk back felt quieter somehow, the snow carrying your footsteps softly, the wind moving the bare branches above so they rattled faintly together like distant chimes, singing only for the empty hillsides. When the cottage door closed behind you, the warmth met your face with a weight so sudden it felt like stepping into a memory rather than a room. The fire bright, the bread's scent filling every corner until the air itself felt thick with it. You always sat for a moment before speaking to anyone, your hands wrapped around a cup of tea, the steam rising toward your face with the smell of herbs gathered. Last summer, when the world was green and buzzing with softer winds, outside, the day moved on slowly, the sun climbing higher but never burning away the frost clinging stubbornly to every stone and fence post, as though winter itself had decided to stay until it was ready to loosen its hold. The castle gates waited above it all, holding their silence the way trees hold the shape of snow upon their branches, patient and unmoving, as though 100 winters could come and go before they would change at all. And in the warmth of the cottage, with the fire leaning low and the windows showing only the white hush of the hills, you found yourself certain that the gates would wait as long as they wished, no matter how many mornings you returned. There were days when the wind softened, leaving the valley held in a stillness so complete that even the smoke rising from the chimneys seemed hesitant to move, curling upward in slow, pale spirals before dissolving against the waiting sky. You would walk outside on mornings like this and feel the quiet resting against your coat like another layer of fabric, the air carrying only the faint scent of snow and pine and the far-off memory of wood smoke drifting through unmoving air. The path that led toward the hills shone faintly beneath the thin crust of ice that had formed overnight, each footprint breaking through with a soft, deliberate sound, the kind of sound that vanishes almost before you can notice it. Every branch along the way seemed touched with crystal, the frost catching the slow sunlight so that each tree looked draped in threads of glass, the whole forest holding itself still as though unwilling to disturb its own brightness. You would always pause beside the stream, even though the water moved sluggishly beneath the ice, the air above it carrying a different kind of cold, sharper and smelling faintly of stone and the hidden places where sunlight never reached. The bridge that crossed it creaked faintly when you stepped onto its boards, the wood hardened by frost, the rails lined with beads of ice that caught the light so brightly they seemed almost to glow from within. On the other side, the ground climbed toward the hill where the castle waited, its walls visible even through the trees, the towers rising like dark fingers against the pale sky, as though they belonged to another time entirely. You always felt the air grow thinner as you climbed, the warmth of the cottage falling away behind you until your breath came out in slow, white curls that drifted above your scarf before vanishing into the long, cold silence. The snow along the path deepened in places where the wind had not cleared it, your boots sinking softly with each step, the sound muffled and close, as though the whole world had wrapped itself in a thick, patient hush. Sometimes a bird lifted suddenly from the branches above, its wings scattering small avalanches of snow that landed in faint bursts against the frozen ground, the air trembling briefly before falling quiet again. The gates waited as always, the iron pale with frost, the heavy wood marked by the long patience of the seasons, the bolts and hinges dark against the brightness of the snow piled against their base in soft, unmoving drifts. You never knew whether anyone watched from the high towers, because the narrow windows gave nothing away, their blackness unchanged no matter how long you looked or how much the sunlight slid across the cold stone walls. The air here always smelled faintly of metal and ice, a thin, sharp scent that clung to the iron bars and drifted slowly outward. Whenever the wind shifted, just enough to bring it down toward the waiting path below, you would rest there with your back against the low stone wall, the cold seeping through your coat slowly until you felt it along your shoulders and arms, the kind of cold that moved patiently rather than sharply, as though it had nowhere else to be. The hills stretched endlessly below, their shapes softened by snow until they looked more like folded blankets than earth and stone, the river winding darkly between them in a slow line that broke through the white in places where it had not yet frozen. Sometimes you would close your eyes there and listen, the wind carrying small sounds you could never place, a faint creak, the distant groan of wood, the sigh of snow falling from branches somewhere deep in the trees behind you. The smell of the forest came faintly when the wind turned, pine and damp bark, and the hidden scent of earth locked beneath the frozen ground, all of it carrying the weight of seasons that had passed without disturbing the waiting gates above. You would open your eyes slowly then and see the sunlight sliding higher along the walls, the brightness pooling along the edges of the towers, while the shadows stayed thick across the closed wood of the gates themselves. The warmth never seemed to reach them fully, as though the gates had been built from a night that sunlight could not touch, each hinge and beam holding its own darkness, the way stones hold the memory of heat long after the fire is gone. Some afternoons you brought bread with you, the crust wrapped in cloth to keep the warmth in, though by the time you sat with your back against the wall, the heat had slipped away, leaving only the faint scent of flour and smoke clinging to it. You would eat slowly while watching the crows lift and settle along the battlements, their wings black against the pale sky, their calls sharp enough to echo faintly before the hills swallowed the sound and left the air quiet once again. The tea stayed hot longer, its steam rising between your gloves as you cupped it close, the smell of dried leaves carrying the taste of late summer, when the air had been thick with warmth and bees moved drowsily among the flowers outside the cottage. You always drank it slowly, each swallow moving through you like something borrowed from another season entirely, as though the memory of warmth mattered more than the warmth itself here beneath the waiting walls. When the sun began to lower, the air shifted toward evening, the light turning thin and gold along the edges of the hills, while the snow deepened its blue. Shadows, as though gathering itself for the colder hours ahead. The gates never moved, never gave away even the smallest hint of what lay beyond them. Their silence so complete it felt almost alive, as though the wood itself listened but never answered, holding its own long, patient breath. You would gather your things slowly before leaving, the last of the tea cooling in the cup. The bread wrapped again, though it had grown stiff in the deepening cold, the wind carrying faint threads of night down from the hills above. The walk back felt longer beneath the fading light, the snow reflecting the last colors of day, so that the world seemed painted in soft strokes of silver and blue, the air sharpening with each step toward the valley below. By the time the cottage lights came into view, the sky had deepened into that quiet color that comes before stars. The first thin streak of smoke rising from the chimney, carrying the promise of heat and supper and firelit walls. You would close the door behind you and feel the warmth meet your face like a tide rushing inward, the air thick with the smell of soup on the hearth and the slow crackle of logs giving themselves to flame. And while you sat there with your boots drying, there were mornings when the sky opened in a pale wash of silver, the kind of light that carried no warmth yet softened the edges of everything it touched, as though the whole world had been brushed in frost before waking. You would wake to the sound of the wind whispering faintly against the shutters, the thin boards clicking softly as though in quiet conversation, while the fire in the hearth had long since settled into a low red glow beneath the ashes. The air inside the cottage felt still at such hours, carrying the faint smell of charred wood and wool blankets warmed through the night, the corners of the room holding to their shadows, while the pale window waited for the first sunlight. Pulling on your coat always brought a faint shiver, the fabric cold where it had hung untouched since evening, its weight settling across your shoulders like a quiet companion ready to follow you through the sleeping hills once more. Outside, the snow gave back the early light in muted colors, faint blue where the drifts lay deep, soft gray where wind had swept the earth bare, the air tasting of iron and pine and the faint sweetness of distant smoke rising unseen. Each step across the yard broke through the crusted snow with a sound that felt too loud for the hour, your breath clouding the air ahead while the cottage door closed behind you with a small thud that the valley seemed to swallow whole. The path up the hill carried its familiar turns, the earth hidden beneath a thin lace of frost, the branches overhead brittle with ice that trembled faintly whenever the wind gathered enough strength to move through the waiting trees. Sometimes the sun would catch on the ice-bound branches so that they glimmered with brief colors, faint greens and pinks like the inside of seashells, the light gone almost before you could look twice, leaving only the quiet silver once again. The stream waited, as always, its water a slow dark line beneath the frozen edges, the air above it sharper than the rest of the valley, as though the cold lived here more deeply, carrying the smell of stone and running water locked beneath. Crossing the bridge brought the faint groan of wood under your boots, the planks stiff with frost, the rails lined with small feathers of ice where the wind had blown snow against them until it froze into delicate shapes no hand could make. The hill rose slowly beyond, its slope carrying you toward the waiting towers, the path narrowing where the trees leaned in close, their branches knitted above, like fingers holding the pale winter sky in place above the snow-dark earth. You would feel the cold deepening with each step upward, not harsh but steady, the kind that moved through gloves and boots slowly, the way water moves through cloth, until it became part of your breath and skin, and the rhythm of your walk. The castle always came into view the same way. First, the farthest tower, lifting above the tree line, then the walls spreading outward in gray stillness, the whole shape fixed against the sky, like something the wind had forgotten to erode. The gates held their place at the center, iron and wood closed so firmly it was impossible to imagine the sound of them moving, as though the hinges had long ago grown into the stone itself and learned the patience of the hills. You would stand before them as you always did, your boots in the same patch of cleared earth where the wind swept the snow thin, your breath rising in slow curls, while the shadows clung to the narrow space beneath the archway above. Sometimes it seemed the silence here had weight, pressing gently around your shoulders, carrying the faint smells of iron and bark, and the hidden dampness of stone that had held centuries of snowmelt deep in its unmoving heart. The wind brought only the smallest sounds, the caw of a distant crow, the rustle of branches somewhere far down the hill, the soft crack as ice shifted along the edges of the stream, Belucci sound fading quickly back into stillness. You would set down your pack near the low wall, as though arriving at a place you had been expected, your gloves brushing snow from the stones so you could sit with your back against them, the cold seeping inward at its own patient pace. From here the view stretched endlessly across the valley, the hills folding into each other like blankets tossed aside, the farthest peaks softened by distance until they seemed made of smoke rather than earth and rock and winter weight. The tea always came first, its steam rising between your hands as you poured, the smell faintly sweet and green against the sharper scents of snow and wood and iron, the heat moving slowly into your fingers before slipping upward toward your face. Drinking it felt like borrowing warmth from another season, each swallow carrying a memory of sunlight through tall grass, of wind moving softly through orchards, of afternoons where shadows were the only place the air felt cool enough to breathe. Sometimes you brought bread or cheese wrapped carefully in cloth, the food carrying with it the faint smell of the hearth where it had waited through the night, the taste simple but grounding against the thin air of the watching hills. The crows shifted often along the battlements above, black shapes against the pale sky, their calls brief but carrying, as though they alone had words for what the walls remembered, and the wind had long since stopped trying to ask. You would follow their movements with your eyes while eating, watching them lift and settle and lift again, the air trembling briefly each time before falling still, the snow along the walls unbroken except where their wings scattered it loose. The sun moved slowly as you sat there, the shadows creeping along the gates but never crossing them, as though even the light carried some unspoken agreement not to disturb whatever waited behind those long-closed doors. By afternoon, the air began to sharpen, the pale sky deepening toward blue while the hills gathered their lengthening shadows, the valley below losing its color slowly until only the snow seemed to hold the light a little longer. You always lingered, even as the cold grew heavier, as though leaving too soon might break the spell of the place, your boots resting in the same shallow prints, your pack leaning against the same wall where frost spread in delicate lines. When at last you gathered your things, the wind had begun its evening song through the trees, low and steady, carrying the smell of wood smoke from the cottages below where the first fires of night were waking in their stone chimneys. The walk downward felt quieter than the climb, your steps slower as the sky dimmed above the hills, the path familiar beneath the deepening shadows. The first star appearing faintly over the farthest ridge before you reached the waiting stream. Crossing the bridge again, you would pause briefly to watch the water shift beneath its thin skin of ice, the darkness moving slowly as though even the river felt the weight of winter pressing it towards stillness. By the time the cottage lights appeared through the trees, the valley had gathered its night fully, the air smelling of smoke and pine and the faint sweetness of bread carried on the wind from windows glowing against the dark. Inside, the fire greeted you with its small crackle, the warmth settling across your face and hands, the room carrying the scents of wool and drying wood and the quiet comfort of things that belonged only to evening. And as you sat there, listening to the wind at the shutters, you thought of the gates above the hill, still closed against the gathering night, still waiting, as though they held a silence the world itself had promised never to break. The night comes softly over the hills, as though it has been walking a long road of shadows, carrying the scent of pine, resin, and damp earth on its shoulders, while the castle lies waiting under a sky deepening to violet. You feel the air change first before the darkness thickens, a gentle stirring against your skin like the breath of something vast and unseen, carrying with it the taste of cold stone and the faint memory of rain long since fallen. The lamps in the village below glow like shy stars as windows begin to close one by one, their shutters creaking softly, while smoke drifts upward in loose ribbons that carry the smell of wood, ash, and winter apples. You stand near the gates as you have before, though tonight the silence seems deeper, as though the walls themselves have swallowed their own echoes and left behind only the hush of the wind in the towers. The iron of the gates glimmers faintly where the last of the daylight touches them, the metal holding its chill stubbornly, as though it were carved from ice rather than forged in fire so many generations ago. Your hand lingers over the rough grain of the wooden beams set deep within the gates, feeling the cracks and knots beneath your fingertips like the lines of an ancient map leading nowhere at all. Somewhere behind you, the faint sound of hooves fades down the road, steady and unhurried, as though even the riders know there is no point in pressing against time when the gates have not opened for so long. The cold carries the smell of iron and the faint bitterness of leaves that have fallen and gathered in the corners of the walls, their edges curling like old letters unread for 100 years. You think of how many winters have passed while these gates stood here, holding back the seasons like a great hand cupped against the wind, while snow climbed their edges and spring sunlight found no welcome inside. It feels as though the gates have become less a barrier and more a memory themselves, a shape the world grew around while waiting for something unnamed to finally arrive from beyond the horizon. The torches along the walls flicker against the stone with restless light, casting long shadows that move like slow dancers over the towers, though the guards themselves are long gone from their posts. You wonder if those who once stood here felt the same weight of silence, the same breathless expectancy, or if they only saw stone and duty without hearing the low hum of waiting in the air. The night wind carries the faint clatter of something loose in the ramparts, perhaps a forgotten chain or a piece of wood shifting after so many years of frost and thaw, carving through it grain by grain. You think of how time moves differently here, each hour folding back upon itself like the turning of a slow river, its currents too soft to be seen, yet shaping the banks with patient persistence. The sky above the towers deepens to ink blue, where the first stars tremble faintly into sight, their cold light brushing the stone with silver edges so thin they feel like whispers rather than illumination. A barn owl glides over the walls with wings as silent as breath, vanishing into the tree line beyond where shadows pool like water. As though even the creatures of night cross this place without disturbing it. You can smell the moss clinging to the lower stones, where the earth stays damp even in summer. A dark greenness rising when the wind shifts just enough to carry it upward toward you. The air holds the faint sweetness of hay from the distant fields where late harvests still linger under tarps, though frost will find them soon, as it always does when the nights grow long. Standing there, you feel as though you are listening not only to this place, but to all the winters folded inside its silence, each one leaving its breath along the walls like layers of old paint. The castle itself seems to breathe slower than the night around it, each stone exhaling the heat of the vanished day with the patience of something that has stood too long to be hurried. The gates do not move, yet you imagine the weight behind them, the weight of doors swollen with centuries of snowmelt and sun, with the press of countless mornings and evenings leaning against their hinges. Somewhere an unseen bell gives a single hollow note before falling quiet again, the sound carrying through the air like a pebble dropped into deep water and swallowed before reaching the bottom. The scent of candle smoke drifts faintly from a narrow slit of window high above, though you see no flame within, only the ghost of its presence winding down through the night air. It feels as though the castle remembers you each time you return, though it never speaks except through the groan of wood or the cry of iron contracting when the frost settles after midnight. The moon lifts slowly behind the eastern hills until its light rests along the highest battlements, tracing the worn edges of stone with the same hand that has traced them every month for longer than anyone recalls. Your shadow lies faintly on the ground before you where the moonlight spills through the iron latticework of the gates, patterning the earth with shapes like sleeping branches in winter. You remain there for a long while, as though waiting for the wind to carry some forgotten answer. Though the night keeps its silence with the same devotion, the gates keep their vigil. When at last you turn to leave, the road behind you is pale under the moonlight, the frost beginning to gather at its edges like lace stitched carefully along a hem by unseen fingers. The village windows below have all gone dark now, except for one where a single lamp burns low, its light trembling in the cold air like a heartbeat refusing to yield to sleep. You carry the chill of the gates with you as you walk, the smell of stone and iron lingering faintly as though clinging to your cloak, a reminder of places that do not open easily. The night closes gently around you again, the stars higher now, the wind softer, while behind you the castle waits as it always has, its gates unmoved, its silence unbroken, its patience endless. The night stretches long before you as though it has no intention of ending soon, its quiet folding over the hills in layers of blue and silver, until the world feels wrapped in some ancient, unbroken hush. You move slowly along the familiar road where frost has begun to gather, each step pressing lightly into the pale dusting that glimmers under the moonlight, like a scattering of powdered glass across the earth. The air carries the faintest echo of water moving somewhere unseen, perhaps a narrow stream hidden beyond the trees. its voice softened by distance until it sounds like the low hum of memory itself. Above you, the stars burn faint but steady, their light traveling so far to reach this cold corner of the world that it feels almost like an act of devotion, a promise kept across centuries of waiting. The castle stands against the sky, as it always has, its towers dark shapes rising where stone meets night. The edges, softened by mist, curling upward from the river below like smoke from a sleeping hearth. You feel the weight of its walls before you even draw close, the sense of mass and time pressing outward as though the centuries themselves were standing guard, silent and unyielding under the frost-heavy air. The gates remain shut, their iron bands cold enough to hold the moonlight like water, each bolt glimmering faintly as though lit from within by something too patient to be seen. Your hand brushes the rough grain of the nearest post, and the chill seems to sink straight through your skin into the bones beneath, carrying with it the faint taste of iron and dust left by countless seasons. The wind shifts gently, bringing the smell of cedar from the woods beyond the road where snow lies shallow between the roots, its sharp sweetness mingling with the deeper scent of stone grown damp in the night. Somewhere high along the battlements, an owl gives a low cry before falling silent again, its voice carried far across the hills like a single word spoken and then forgotten by the air itself. You think of the people who once crossed this threshold freely, their footsteps sounding on the stones now covered by moss and time, the warmth of torches throwing restless light along the walls as doors swung open wide. Now the silence feels almost alive, a living thing woven into the wood and iron so completely that even the wind seems careful when it passes through the empty arrow slits above the gatehouse. A memory rises of sunlight in this place long ago, of banners stirring against blue skies and the smell of bread drifting from open courtyards. Though whether it is your memory or only the castle's, you cannot tell. The night keeps layering itself thicker, as though laying down a blanket of hours, each one stitched with cold stars and the faint rustle of bare branches shifting against one another in the wind. The frost spreads slowly up the gates like a quiet tide climbing a dark shore, the white tracing each hinge and rivet until the metal itself seems carved from winter rather than forged by fire long ago. You stand there for a long while, listening to the soundless rhythm of the place, the way the air seems to breathe in slow cycles, each exhale carrying the scent of smoke from some unseen chimney far below. The moon leans westward now, its light turning pale gold where it slips behind thin veils of cloud, leaving the towers edged in silver that softens each line until they seem carved from the sky itself. You remember how the road once felt alive with carts and riders when the harvests were brought through, wheels clattering and hooves striking sparks from the stones, the smell of grain and leather filling the air like a hymn. Now only the faint rustle of frost-crusted grass marks the passing of the wind. A quiet so deep it seems the land itself has settled into some long patience beside the closed gates. Somewhere a loose shutter knocks faintly in the dark, its sound carried thin and hollow through the stillness before the wind turns and takes it away again toward the sleeping fields below. You wonder if those who built these walls imagined 100 winters gathering here. Snow leaning against the doors, ivy sinking its roots into the mortar, while the gates stood unmoved as though waiting for the sky to change. The thought drifts through you slowly like silt through water, leaving no answer behind except the sense of time pressing outward in all directions, until even the air feels shaped by its weight. Your breath comes out in faint clouds that catch the moonlight before vanishing, each one rising upward like a small signal that no one will see from the towers where the watchmen are long gone. The silence holds so firmly it feels like part of the stone itself, as though chiseled into the walls, along with the grooves, where rainwater runs each spring when the thaw finally comes down from the hills. You think of how the gates must sound if they ever open again, the groan of wood swelling with age, the echo rolling through the courtyards like distant thunder across empty hills after years of holding their breath. For a moment you close your eyes and feel the night pressing cool against your face, the roughness of the gate beneath your hand, the faint sweetness of hay lingering from the stables, long abandoned inside the walls. When you look again, the stars have shifted higher, sharpening in the clear air as though the sky itself keeps watch, while the earth turns slowly beneath its patient light. The wind falls still at last, leaving only the faint creak of branches in the wood and the far-off call of something crossing the river, where mist lies pale against the water. You turn back toward the road after a while, your steps slow where frost crunches softly underfoot, carrying the memory of iron and moonlight with you like a weight too familiar to set down. The village lights lie scattered below like fallen stars, one or two still burning where doors have not yet closed, the smoke from their chimneys winding upward in thin threads toward the indifferent dark. Behind you the gates wait as they always have, the frost gathering thicker now along their edges, the silence folding itself once more into the wood and stone, as though tucking the castle in for another long night. Morning does not come quickly here, as though the sky itself prefers to linger in its long hours of darkness, stretching the last of night across the hills until even the stars seem reluctant to leave their quiet watch. You walk the same narrow road toward the castle, where the frost still clings to the grass in pale threads, the air carrying a breath of wood smoke from some distant hearth where someone stirs long before the sun rises. The ground feels hard beneath your feet, the stones holding the cold as though the winter has pressed itself deep into their heart, each step giving a faint echo that drifts away slowly toward the sleeping valley below. The wind has gone still this morning, the trees standing silent in their dark shapes along the hillsides, the last leaves curled into themselves like tiny fists of gold clinging stubbornly to the ends of bare branches. You pass the frozen stream where thin ice lies stretched like glass over the water, the slow current beneath moving just enough to catch the starlight in broken glimmers before disappearing again into the dark hollow of reeds. The sky carries a hint of gray now along the horizon, a faint paling that feels less like day arriving than like night finally loosening its hold after too many hours spent wrapped around the world. You draw closer to the castle where the walls rise, as they always have, their stone darkened by centuries of rain and snow, the edges softened where lichen has crept along the ledges in patterns like forgotten writing. The gates stand before you unchanged, tall and silent, and heavy with the weight of 100 winters. The wood worn smooth, where time itself seems to have brushed against it like a hand passing each year in turn. Your fingers rest lightly against the iron bands, the chill seeping through your skin until it reaches the bone, the metal holding the night's cold, as though no sun has touched it in all the long seasons behind you. The stillness here feels almost kind now, as though the gates have grown used to your visits, their silence offering not rejection, but a quiet companionship that expects nothing more than your steady presence beside them. Somewhere high in the towers, a single crow stirs, its wings lifting briefly against the paleening sky before it settles again, the faint rustle falling like a small sound stitched carefully into the larger hush of morning. You imagine the halls beyond, the long tables covered in dust where once there were voices and firelight, the stairways curling upward through shadows where footsteps have not passed in so many years. The air feels folded and still. The kitchens must still hold the faint memory of bread baked on winter mornings, the warmth of steam against windows now clouded with age, though all of it lies locked behind the doors that refuse to move for anyone. You think of the countless seasons piling up behind these gates like drifts of snow against the walls, each one leaving its trace in the cracks and corners, until the whole place seems woven through with time's own threads. The first pale light touches the highest tower now, turning its frost to silver that glimmers softly before fading as the sun edges higher, though the warmth never reaches far enough to trouble the chill around the gates. You remember how the valley once sounded at this hour, the bells carrying across the fields from far-off chapels, the calls of herders driving sheep through the lower gates when the harvest wagons waited along the road below. Now there is only the slow creak of ice settling on the river, where mist curls upward like breath, the sound faint and hollow, as though the earth itself has begun to speak only in whispers. You wonder if anyone will ever open these gates again, if some spring yet to come will find the hinges groaning awake, the doors swinging wide to let sunlight chase away the dust sleeping on the old stones inside. Perhaps the castle itself does not wish to wake, its towers leaning toward one another like shoulders against the cold, the windows staring outward with the empty patience of eyes that have grown used to watching rather than speaking. The wind stirs at last with the smell of pine drifting down from the high ridges, sharp and clean as though the forest itself has taken a long breath and now exhales slowly across the waiting walls below. You stay until the sun edges finally above the hills, its light turning the frost to a brief glitter before it melts into nothing, leaving only dampness on the wood where the gates remain shut and unmoved. The crow lifts again from the tower as though pulled into the widening sky, its wings cutting across the pale air before it vanishes toward the far edge of the valley, where smoke still rises from the waking village. You turn from the gates at last, the long road stretching back through the fields where shadows shorten slowly with the day, each step carrying the weight of silence and frost and the 100 winters behind these walls. The castle remains behind you as you go, its towers paling against the brightening sky, the gates standing where they always have, holding back whatever waits on the other side with the same unbroken patience as before. The air warms slowly along the hillsides where snow begins to soften under the sun, the distant sound of water running free again, reaching faintly across the fields where the earth remembers its rivers each spring without fail. Still the gates remain closed, as though they belong to some other rhythm than the turning of seasons, some deeper measure of time that counts years the way wind counts leaves along the edge of winter forests. You look back once, before the road curves away, the walls fading behind bare branches and drifting mist. The last of the towers, catching the sunlight, like a blade that has not moved in centuries of waiting. Perhaps they will open one day, or perhaps they will stand forever with frost gathering each winter along the hinges. The silence deepening like water in a well until the world grows quiet enough to hear it breathing. For now the castle waits, as it always has, the long centuries pressed into its stones. The gates standing between what was and what will be, unmoved through all the turning skies above its patient walls. And as you walk on, the road stretching toward, the fields washed with pale morning light, you carry the hush of this place with you, the memory of doors that have forgotten the sound of opening, lingering like a dream.